The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom, and in that moment, Chen watched her entire world crack open just like the crystal at her feet. But it wasn't the broken glass that made the crowd of 200 wedding guests gasp. It was the video playing on the massive screen behind the bride and groom's table, the one that was supposed to show their love story, their journey together. Instead, it showed her husband of 6 years, Marcus, in their bed, with her sister. And the timestamp read 3 days ago. Sarah stood at the tech booth in the back, her fingers still pressed on the remote, watching Marcus's face drain of all color as he realized what was happening. Her sister Emma lurched to her feet, knocking over a tower of champagne glasses. The room erupted into chaos, but Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Because this wasn't even close to the revenge she had planned. This was just the opening act. What the guests didn't know, what Marcus and Emma couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Sarah had discovered something far more sinister than an affair. She'd stumbled onto evidence that would destroy more than just a marriage. It would shatter reputations, end careers, and possibly land people in prison. And she'd spent the last 3 months making sure every detail was perfect, every piece of evidence was documented, and every trap was set. The video on the screen was merely bait, designed to make them panic, to make them sloppy. Sarah needed them to run, to make phone calls, to reach out to their accomplices. Because Marcus and Emma weren't just having an affair. They were stealing from Sarah's family trust, the one her late father had built over 30 years, the one worth $12 million. The video continued playing, showing different dates, different positions, different rooms in the house Sarah had bought with her inheritance. She'd installed cameras everywhere after she found the first burner phone hidden in Marcus's gym bag 2 months ago. She wasn't looking for it. She'd been searching for his spare car keys because hers were dead and she was late for a doctor's appointment. The phone was wedged behind the water bottle pocket, turned off, but the very existence of a secret phone told her everything she needed to know. Or so she thought. When she finally managed to crack the passcode, using Marcus's mother's birthday combined with his lucky number, she expected to find messages from a mistress. What she found instead made her physically ill. There were texts to Emma, yes, but they weren't just planning their next hookup. They were planning how to drain Sarah's trust fund, how to forge her signature on transfer documents, how to make it look like she was the one embezzling. Marcus jumped up from the head table, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He was shouting something, pointing at Sarah, but she couldn't hear him over the screaming guests and the audio from the video, which featured Emma saying, "God, I can't believe she still doesn't suspect anything. My sister is so pathetically trusting." Sarah watched Marcus start pushing through the crowd toward her. Security, her security, the men she'd hired specifically for today, stepped into his path. He tried to shove past them, but they held firm. Emma was crying at the table, her mascara running in black rivers down her face, her hands covering her mouth in what might have looked like shame to anyone who didn't know better. But Sarah knew better. Emma had always been a skilled actress, always able to cry on command, always able to play the victim when consequences came calling. If you want to see how this story of betrayal and revenge unfolds, make sure you click that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The foundation of Sarah's world had been built on what she thought was solid ground. She and Marcus met 8 years ago at a charity gala for pediatric cancer research. Sarah was there representing her father's company, Chen Medical Innovations, a biotech firm that specialized in developing affordable medical equipment for underserved communities. Marcus was there as a guest of his firm, a mid-level financial advisor at Sterling Investment Group. He approached her at the bar, making a joke about the rubber chicken they'd been served for dinner, and she'd laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time since her father's diagnosis 6 months earlier. Marcus had kind eyes, or at least she thought they were kind back then. He listened when she talked about her father's declining health, about her fear of losing him, about the pressure of possibly running the company one day. He didn't try to fix everything with empty platitudes. He just listened, and in her grief and vulnerability, that felt like love. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. It was at the same hotel, the Grand Meridian, in the same ballroom where Sarah was now orchestrating his public destruction. He'd gotten down on one knee during another charity gala, in front of 300 people, and she'd said yes because it felt like fate, like the universe completing a circle. Her father died 3 months before the wedding, and Marcus held her through every tear, every sleepless night, every moment when the weight of loss threatened to crush her completely. He helped plan the funeral, dealt with the lawyers and accountants, stepped in to handle details when she couldn't bear to make another decision. He became her rock, her anchor, her safe harbor. Or so she believed. Looking back now, with the clarity that comes from betrayal, Sarah could see how carefully he'd positioned himself, how strategically he'd made himself indispensable during her most vulnerable moments. The marriage felt normal for the first few years. They bought a house in Pacific Heights, a beautiful Victorian that Sarah paid for with her inheritance but put in both their names because that's what married people did, right? They shared everything. Marcus's career advanced steadily, though never quite as quickly as he wanted. He'd complain about being passed over for promotions, about younger guys with better connections getting the accounts he deserved. Sarah would encourage him, support him, sometimes even leverage her family's business connections to send clients his way. She was building him up, investing in their shared future, never once considering that he might see her not as a partner but as a resource to be exploited. They had dinner parties with friends, took vacations to Italy and Thailand, talked about having children someday when the timing was right. She worked long hours at Chen Medical, transitioning into the CEO role her father had prepared her for, while Marcus handled their personal finances. He insisted on it, said it would take stress off her plate, and she'd agreed gratefully, never imagining what that access would cost her. Emma had always been in their lives, always hovering at the periphery. She was Sarah's younger sister by 4 years, beautiful and charming but perpetually struggling. She'd dropped out of college twice, bounced between jobs in marketing, PR, and event planning, never quite finding her footing. She'd had a string of failed relationships, always dating men who turned out to be losers or cheaters or both. Sarah had always felt protective of her, guilty even, because she'd gotten their father's business sense and drive while Emma seemed to have gotten only his stubborn streak without the discipline to match. Sarah hired Emma to work at Chen Medical 2 years ago, giving her a position in community outreach that paid well and required minimal oversight. She'd thought she was helping her sister, giving her stability and a sense of purpose. Instead, she'd given Emma access to company files, to her schedule, to her life, and Emma had used every bit of that access to betray her in the most fundamental way possible. The betrayal hurt because Sarah had loved them both completely and without reservation. She'd trusted Marcus with her body, her future, her most vulnerable self. She'd trusted Emma with her childhood memories, her family legacy, her unconditional sisterly love. And they'd taken that trust and weaponized it, turned it into a tool for their own gain. The first red flag appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September, though Sarah didn't recognize it as a red flag at the time. She'd woken up early to prep for a board meeting and needed to print some documents. Marcus's laptop was closer than hers, sitting open on the kitchen counter. She didn't think twice about using it. They shared devices all the time, had each other's passwords, operated with complete transparency. Or so she thought. When she opened his browser, she saw tabs for offshore banking sites, cryptocurrency exchanges, and a PDF titled Revocable Trust Amendment Draft. Her name was on the document, but she'd never seen it before, never authorized any amendments to her father's trust. Sarah's hand started shaking as she scrolled through the document. It transferred signatory authority for the trust to Marcus as her designated financial representative, with Emma listed as a backup. The document was dated 2 weeks ago and bore what looked like her signature at the bottom, but Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she'd never signed it. She'd never even discussed amending the trust with Marcus. Her father had set it up to be ironclad, with strict provisions about how funds could be accessed and used. There were multiple layers of approval required for any significant withdrawals, safeguards designed to protect the family legacy. But if this amendment was somehow filed with the trustee bank, those safeguards would crumble. Marcus would have unilateral access to everything. Sarah took photos of everything on the laptop with her phone, her mind racing through explanations that might make this innocent. Maybe Marcus was just exploring options, doing research on their finances. Maybe the document was a draft he planned to discuss with her. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation that would make all of this make sense. But deep in her gut, in that place where instinct lives before rationality can dilute it, Sarah knew something was very wrong. She closed the laptop carefully, making sure to leave it exactly as she'd found it, and went to her own computer to print her board meeting documents. She sat through 4 hours of presentations and strategic planning discussions without absorbing a single word, her mind churning through possibilities and implications. When she got home that evening, Marcus was in the shower. She grabbed his laptop again and went through his email, his documents, his search history, digging deeper into the digital trail he'd left behind. What she found made her stomach turn. There were emails to Emma, dozens of them, discussing the plan and the timeline. There were messages to the trustee bank asking about the process for updating beneficiary information. There were searches for how long until fraud is detected and statute of limitations financial crimes California. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a surprise. This was deliberate, calculated theft. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she found the messages between Marcus and Emma that made it clear the affair had been going on for over 2 years, since before Sarah's father died. They'd been sleeping together at family gatherings, at company events, probably in Sarah's own home when she was working late at the office. Emma's messages were full of complaints about Sarah, calling her uptight and controlling and too focused on the company. Marcus's responses agreed, painting Sarah as an obstacle to their happiness, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. They talked about Sarah like she was a mark, a target, something to be manipulated and discarded once they'd gotten what they needed. Reading those messages, Sarah felt something inside her freeze over, all the warmth and trust and love she'd carried for both of them crystallizing into something cold and sharp and diamond hard. She didn't confront them that night. She didn't scream or cry or throw things, though part of her wanted to burn the whole house down with them inside it. Instead, she closed the laptop, placed it exactly where it had been, and went to bed next to her husband like nothing had changed. Marcus came out of the shower smelling like her expensive body wash, crawled into bed beside her, and kissed her forehead goodnight like he'd done 1,000 times before. Sarah lay there in the dark, listening to him breathe, and began planning her response with the same methodical precision her father had taught her to apply to business problems. She would document everything, build an airtight case, and then she would destroy them both so completely they'd never recover. But she needed time, needed them to feel safe enough to continue, to make mistakes, to dig themselves deeper into the hole they'd created. The next suspicious event came 3 days later when Sarah arranged to work from home unexpectedly. She told Marcus she had a migraine and couldn't face the office, then set up her laptop in the upstairs study while he thought she was resting in the darkened bedroom. She'd already installed hidden cameras in the main living areas, tiny wireless devices disguised as smoke detectors and picture frames, and she pulled up the feeds on her computer. Around 11 in the morning, Emma let herself in with a key Sarah didn't know she had. Marcus met her at the door, and within minutes they were tearing each other's clothes off in the living room, on the couch Sarah had picked out, under the wedding photos hanging on the wall. Sarah watched the feed with clinical detachment, taking screenshots and saving the video files to an encrypted cloud drive. She needed evidence, needed documentation, needed proof that would stand up in divorce court and possibly criminal court depending on how far they'd gotten with the embezzlement scheme. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after, when they were getting dressed and Emma's phone rang. She put it on speaker, and Sarah heard her own company's CFO, Richard Morrison, on the other end. Richard was asking about the revised trust documents and whether they'd been signed yet. Emma assured him they were almost ready, that they just needed to wait for the right moment when Sarah was distracted. Richard's laugh was ugly and knowing. He said something about his finder's fee, about how he'd finally be able to afford that house in Napa he'd been eyeing. Sarah's vision went red around the edges. Richard had worked with her father for 15 years, had been at his bedside when he died, had given a eulogy at his funeral about loyalty and legacy. And now he was conspiring with her husband and sister to loot the company her father had built from nothing. The scope of the betrayal expanded like a shockwave, revealing layer after layer of deception and greed. Sarah realized this wasn't just about Marcus and Emma's affair or their plan to steal from the trust. This was a coordinated effort involving someone with deep access to company finances, someone who could manipulate records and hide transactions. Richard could authorize transfers, approve unusual expenses, override security protocols. With his cooperation, they could potentially drain millions before anyone noticed something was wrong. Sarah understood in that moment that she wasn't just fighting to save her marriage or her inheritance. She was fighting to save her father's legacy, the company that employed 300 people, the mission to make healthcare more accessible that had been his life's work. The anger she felt was so intense it was almost purifying, burning away any remaining doubt or sentimentality. These people had looked her in the eye, had shared meals at her table, had pretended to care about her while plotting to destroy everything she valued. They deserved no mercy, no warning, no opportunity to explain or justify or minimize what they'd done. The third escalating event happened 2 weeks later at the company's quarterly board meeting. Sarah had spent those 2 weeks consulting with lawyers, forensic accountants, and a private investigator named Patricia Williams who specialized in corporate fraud. Patricia was a former FBI agent, sharp-eyed and relentless, exactly the kind of person Sarah needed on her side. Together they'd started tracing the digital fingerprints of the embezzlement scheme. Richard had been skimming money for months, small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, disguised as vendor payments to shell companies that Emma had set up. The amounts had grown bolder recently, $50,000, $75,000, flowing out to offshore accounts that Patricia was working to identify. At the board meeting, Richard presented the quarterly financial report with his usual smooth confidence, showing modest growth and stable expenses. Sarah sat at the conference table taking notes, nodding along, asking occasional questions, playing the role of the engaged CEO while secretly watching him like a hawk watches a mouse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came during a break when Sarah went to the bathroom and overheard Emma on a phone call in the adjacent lounge. Emma was talking to someone about Phase 2, about how once they had control of the trust, they'd push Sarah out of the CEO position entirely. They'd manufacture some kind of scandal, maybe claim she was having a breakdown or making erratic business decisions, force a board vote, and install Marcus as interim CEO with Richard as COO. They'd sell the company within a year to a pharmaceutical conglomerate that had been trying to acquire Chen Medical for years, pocket the proceeds, and disappear. Emma's voice was giddy with excitement as she described the timeline, how they'd be living in the Cayman Islands by next Christmas, sipping drinks on the beach while Sarah dealt with the aftermath of losing everything. Sarah stood frozen in the bathroom stall, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. They weren't just stealing from her. They were planning to erase her father's entire legacy, to sell out to exactly the kind of corporate entity he'd spent his life fighting against. The fourth event was perhaps the most chilling because it revealed how long they'd been planning this. Sarah had hired Patricia to dig into Marcus's background, and what she found was disturbing. Marcus had been fired from his previous firm for unauthorized access to client accounts. The termination had been kept quiet, settled with an NDA and a neutral reference, but Patricia had sources who confirmed the truth. Marcus hadn't randomly met Sarah at that charity gala 8 years ago. He'd researched her, knew about her father's company and the family trust, and deliberately positioned himself to meet her. The kind eyes, the patient listening, the support through her father's illness, it had all been calculated. He'd seen a vulnerable woman with a substantial inheritance and decided she was his ticket to wealth. Everything about their relationship had been built on lies from the very first moment. Even worse, Emma had known about Marcus's plan from the beginning. There were old emails between them dating back 9 years, before Sarah and Marcus had even met, where Emma complained about always being in Sarah's shadow and Marcus suggested they could help each other out. They'd been conspiring against Sarah for nearly a decade, biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering that Marcus had convinced Sarah to make him the beneficiary of her life insurance policy 2 years ago, right after her father died. She remembered the conversation now with horrifying clarity. He'd framed it as practical estate planning, said they needed to protect each other, and she'd agreed because she was drowning in grief and grateful for his stability. The policy was for $5 million. If something happened to Sarah, Marcus would get the trust and the insurance payout and could easily claim spousal inheritance rights to her share of the company. Patricia found searches on Marcus's computer for accidental death investigations and how insurance companies determine suspicious deaths. The implication was unmistakable. They weren't just planning to steal from Sarah. They'd considered killing her if the embezzlement plan fell through. She'd been sleeping next to a man who'd contemplated her murder, who'd weighed her life against his financial gain and found her worth less. The fear Sarah felt during those weeks was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It wasn't the sharp terror of immediate danger but the grinding dread of realizing how completely she'd been deceived, how vulnerable she'd made herself to people who saw her only as an obstacle or an opportunity. She couldn't let on that she knew anything. She had to keep going to work, keep sleeping in the same bed with Marcus, keep having Sunday dinners with Emma, all while knowing what they were planning. She installed a security system in the house without telling Marcus, cameras in every room, motion sensors on all the doors and windows. She started carrying pepper spray in her purse and made sure her assistant knew her location at all times. She updated her will, leaving everything to charity and explicitly disinheriting both Marcus and Emma, just in case they moved faster than she anticipated. She lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, analyzing every meal Marcus prepared for signs of poison, checking her car's brake lines before driving, second-guessing every touch and every smile. The conflict built inside Sarah like pressure in a sealed container. She wanted to scream at them, to shove the evidence in their faces and watch them scramble to explain themselves. She wanted to cry and rage and demand to know how they could do this to her, what she'd done to deserve this level of betrayal. But she couldn't, not yet, not until all the pieces were in place. She confided in Patricia and her lawyer, a fierce woman named Chen, no relation, who specialized in both family law and white-collar crime. Diane helped her understand what evidence they'd need for criminal charges to stick, what documentation would hold up in civil court, how to protect the company and the trust from further theft. Together they built a case that was airtight, irrefutable, devastating. Sarah gave herself a deadline, the company's annual charity gala, which was always held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, the same place Marcus had proposed. She'd arranged for the gala to also serve as a vow renewal ceremony, telling Marcus she wanted to recommit to their marriage in front of their friends and family. He'd been thrilled with the idea, seeing it as proof that she suspected nothing, that she was still the naive trusting wife he could manipulate at will. Make sure you're subscribed because the shocking revelation that comes next will completely blow your mind. The night of the gala arrived with perfect weather, unseasonably warm for November in San Francisco. Sarah got ready in their bedroom while Marcus showered, zipping herself into a custom ivory gown that had cost $15,000. Money well spent, she thought, for the most important performance of her life. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing a stranger staring back, someone harder and colder than the woman who'd existed 3 months ago. That woman was gone, killed by betrayal and replaced by someone who understood that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford and that survival sometimes required ruthlessness. Marcus came out of the bathroom looking handsome in his tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, his smile warm and loving. He kissed her cheek and told her she looked beautiful, and Sarah smiled back and thanked him, playing her role flawlessly. Emma arrived to ride with them to the hotel, wearing a red dress that was too tight and too low-cut, her makeup applied with the heavy hand of someone trying too hard to look sophisticated. The ballroom was stunning, decorated with thousands of white roses and twinkling lights that made everything look ethereal and romantic. 200 guests mingled and drank champagne while a string quartet played classical music. Sarah worked the room like the CEO she was, greeting donors and board members, thanking people for their continued support of Chen Medical's mission. She saw Richard across the room laughing with some investors, and she made sure to catch his eye and wave, watching his smug smile of greeting. She saw Emma flirting with one of Marcus's colleagues, probably already lining up her next mark for when this scheme was complete. She saw Marcus glad-handing and networking, always working an angle, always calculating what each relationship could do for him. And she felt nothing but contempt for all of them, these people who'd worn masks of friendship and family while sharpening knives behind their backs. The vow renewal ceremony was scheduled for 8 o'clock, right before dinner. Sarah and Marcus stood at the front of the room while a minister, someone Sarah had hired specifically for this occasion, spoke about love and commitment and partnership. Marcus held her hands and looked into her eyes with an expression of adoration that might have fooled her 3 months ago but now just looked like mockery. When it came time for them to speak their vows, Sarah went first. She talked about trust and loyalty, about building a life with someone who sees you as a partner rather than a possession. She talked about her father's legacy and what it meant to honor the people who came before us. She talked about accountability and consequences and how sometimes love means having the courage to face hard truths. Marcus's vows were generic and flowery, full of promises about forever and growing old together, words that meant nothing coming from his lying mouth. When the minister pronounced them still married, still bound together, the crowd applauded and champagne was poured for a toast. That's when Sarah walked to the tech booth at the back of the ballroom. The staff member she'd hired specifically for this night, someone Patricia had vouched for, handed her the remote control. Sarah stood there for a moment, her finger hovering over the play button, thinking about her father and what he'd taught her about justice and integrity. Then she pressed play and watched the enormous screen behind the head table light up with footage of Marcus and Emma together. The gasp started immediately, rippling through the crowd like a wave. The video showed date and time stamps, removing any possibility of claiming this was old or misunderstood. It showed multiple encounters in multiple locations, evidence of a sustained affair rather than a single mistake. Sarah had edited the footage herself, choosing the clips that would be most damaging, most humiliating, most undeniable. She watched Marcus's face go from confusion to horror to rage in the space of 3 seconds. She watched Emma lurch to her feet and start crying, her mascara running, her hands shaking. She watched the crowd's reaction shift from shock to anger to righteous indignation as they realized what they were seeing. But the video was just the beginning, just the opening salvo. When Marcus started pushing through the crowd toward Sarah, the security team she'd hired stepped in. They weren't just there to keep him away from her. They were there to serve him with divorce papers and a restraining order. They were there to hand Emma a lawsuit for fraud and embezzlement. They were there to deliver to Richard Morrison a notification that the FBI's white-collar crime division wanted to speak with him about suspicious financial activity at Chen Medical. Sarah had spent 3 months building her case, and she'd made sure every legal avenue was covered before she pulled the trigger. Diane stood near the entrance with 2 federal agents, ready to take statements from witnesses, ready to begin the process of prosecution if anyone tried to flee or destroy evidence. Patricia stood beside Sarah, recording everything on her phone, documenting every reaction and every word for potential use in court. Marcus was shouting now, calling Sarah every ugly name he could think of, his true nature erupting through the veneer of charm he'd maintained for years. He was claiming she'd doctored the footage, that this was all a misunderstanding, that she was crazy and vindictive. But the guests who'd known Sarah her whole life, who'd worked with her father, who'd seen her build the company into what it was, they weren't buying his excuses. They'd seen the evidence, and they knew the truth. Emma tried a different tactic, collapsing into a chair and sobbing about how sorry she was, how it just happened, how she never meant to hurt Sarah. But her apologies rang hollow when Sarah played the next video, the one showing Emma and Richard discussing the embezzlement scheme, talking about shell companies and offshore accounts and how they'd cover their tracks. The room erupted into chaos again, people shouting questions, pulling out their phones to record what was happening, security guards escorting Richard toward the federal agents who were waiting to take him into custody. But the most shocking truth hadn't surfaced yet. Because Sarah had one more revelation, one more piece of evidence that would reframe everything they thought they knew about this situation. She stepped up to the microphone at the front of the room, her voice cutting through the noise, demanding attention. The crowd quieted gradually, all eyes turning to her, waiting to see what else could possibly be revealed after everything they'd already witnessed. Sarah took a breath, steadying herself, and then she told them the rest of the story. She told them about the forged trust amendment, about the plan to steal $12 million, about Marcus's history of financial fraud that he'd hidden from everyone. She told them about the life insurance policy and the searches on Marcus's computer suggesting he'd considered killing her. She told them that Richard had been embezzling from the company for months, that he'd already stolen over $200,000, and that Emma had helped him set up the shell companies to launder the money. The second twist came when Sarah revealed that she hadn't just discovered the embezzlement. She'd tracked where every stolen dollar went, and she'd already recovered most of it. Working with Patricia and Diane and a team of forensic accountants, she traced the offshore accounts, frozen the assets, and initiated legal proceedings to reclaim the funds. More than that, she'd set a trap. 2 weeks ago, she'd authorized a large transfer, telling Richard it was for a major equipment purchase, knowing he'd skim his usual percentage and send it to one of the shell accounts. But this time, the account was being monitored by federal investigators, and the transfer gave them everything they needed to prove criminal intent and establish a pattern of fraud. Richard's attempt to steal that money was what had triggered the FBI investigation, and his cooperation in processing the fraudulent trust amendment had added forgery and conspiracy charges to his growing list of crimes. The emotional punch of this revelation hit the room like a physical force. People who'd thought Sarah was just exposing an affair realized she'd been conducting a months-long investigation into corporate crime. People who'd assumed she'd been blindsided by betrayal understood that she'd actually been 10 steps ahead the entire time, methodically building a case that would not only end her marriage but potentially put 3 people in prison. The narrative they'd been following shifted completely. This wasn't a story about a woman humiliated by her cheating husband. This was a story about a CEO protecting her company, a daughter honoring her father's legacy, and a woman who transformed her pain into power. Sarah stood at that microphone radiating a controlled fury that was far more frightening than any screaming fit could have been. She wasn't a victim. She was a force of nature, and she'd just unleashed a storm that would consume everyone who'd betrayed her. Marcus tried to run. He actually shoved through the crowd and bolted for the exit, only to be stopped by hotel security and the federal agents waiting outside. They arrested him on the spot for fraud and conspiracy, reading him his rights while wedding guests streamed out of the ballroom to watch. Emma collapsed completely, hyperventilating and wailing about how her life was over, how she'd made a mistake, how she needed help. But Sarah felt no sympathy for her sister's tears. Emma had made her choices with clear eyes and malicious intent. She'd weaponized their sibling relationship, exploited Sarah's generosity, and participated in a scheme that could have destroyed everything their father built. She deserved whatever consequences came her way. Richard went quietly, his face gray and defeated, knowing that his career was over and his freedom hung in the balance. The FBI agents loaded all 3 of them into separate cars and drove away, leaving behind a ballroom full of stunned guests and a table full of untouched wedding food. The resolution came in waves over the following weeks and months. Marcus was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and attempted forgery. He made bail but was required to surrender his passport. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Sarah refused to drop any charges. She wanted a trial, wanted everything to be public record, wanted him to face the full consequences of what he'd done. Emma faced similar charges and additional counts related to her role in setting up the shell companies. She tried to play the victim, claiming Marcus had manipulated her, but the evidence of her enthusiastic participation was overwhelming. She eventually took a plea deal that involved testifying against both Marcus and Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. Richard faced the most serious charges because of his position of trust and the amount of money he'd stolen. The FBI's investigation revealed he'd been embezzling for over a year, taking nearly $400,000 total. He went to trial and was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The divorce was finalized in 4 months, a relatively quick process given the overwhelming evidence of adultery and financial malfeasance. Sarah got everything: the house, her trust fund intact, full control of the company, and a judgment against Marcus for his share of the embezzlement proceeds. He'd never see a penny of the life they'd built together because it turned out he'd never actually contributed anything real to that life. He'd been playing a role, collecting a paycheck, and waiting for his chance to cash out. The restraining order remained in place, prohibiting him from contacting Sarah or coming within 500 feet of her home or workplace. Emma tried to reach out several times, sending letters that claimed she was sorry and wanted to rebuild their relationship. Sarah burned every letter without reading past the first line. Some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive, some relationships too poisoned to salvage. Emma wasn't her sister anymore. She was just someone Sarah used to know, someone who'd made terrible choices and would have to live with the consequences. The healing process was slow and nonlinear. Sarah threw herself into work, expanding Chen Medical's mission, increasing their charitable giving, building partnerships with nonprofits and community health centers. She established a foundation in her father's name dedicated to providing free medical equipment to underserved areas. She promoted several long-time employees into leadership positions, bringing in fresh perspectives and ensuring she had people around her she could actually trust. She went to therapy, working through the trauma of betrayal and the violation of having her home and her marriage turned into a crime scene. She learned to trust her instincts again, to believe that not everyone was wearing a mask, that genuine connection was still possible even after experiencing such profound deception. She sold the house in Pacific Heights, unable to live there after everything that had happened, and bought a modern condo with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. She decorated it herself, filling it with art and books and furniture that reflected her taste alone, creating a space that was entirely hers. The emotional takeaway from Sarah's story wasn't about revenge, though that's how it started. It was about agency and self-worth and refusing to be anyone's victim. It was about honoring the people who came before us by protecting what they built. It was about understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to fight back, to expose the truth no matter how ugly, to demand accountability no matter how painful. Sarah's father had taught her that character was revealed not in moments of ease but in moments of crisis. He'd taught her that integrity meant doing the right thing even when it cost you something. He'd taught her that legacy wasn't just about the money or the company but about the values you embodied and passed on to others. By refusing to be crushed by Marcus and Emma's betrayal, by methodically building her case and seeing justice done, Sarah honored everything her father had taught her. She proved that she was worthy of the legacy he'd left her, not because of the money she'd inherited but because of the strength and integrity she'd demonstrated when everything was on the line. A year after the gala, Sarah attended another charity event at the Grand Meridian Hotel. She walked into the same ballroom where her world had imploded and felt nothing but peace. She'd reclaimed the space, refused to let their betrayal taint every memory and every location. She gave a speech that night about resilience and second chances, about how setbacks can become launching pads if you have the courage to rebuild. She talked about her father and the lessons he'd taught her about perseverance and principle. She announced a new initiative to provide job training and healthcare access to formerly incarcerated individuals, because she believed in accountability but also in redemption for people who genuinely wanted to change. The crowd gave her a standing ovation, and Sarah smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in over a year. She'd survived the worst betrayal imaginable and come out stronger on the other side. She'd protected her father's legacy and her own integrity. She'd proven that she was more than just a victim of someone else's cruelty. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who refused to be defined by anyone else's actions. The final line of Sarah's story isn't about Marcus or Emma or Richard. It's not about the money they tried to steal or the trust they violated. It's about Sarah herself, standing in front of a mirror one morning several months after everything ended, looking at her reflection and recognizing the woman staring back. She was different now, harder in some ways but also more authentic, more fully herself than she'd ever been when she was trying to be the perfect wife and sister and daughter. She'd learned that she could survive betrayal, that she could fight back and win, that she could build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's validation or participation. And that knowledge, that deep certainty in her own resilience and worth, was worth more than any marriage or family relationship built on lies. Sarah turned away from the mirror, picked up her coffee, and walked into her day with her head high, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she could handle anything because she'd already survived the worst. If this story touched you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.